Trump's comments and criticism in a number of recent interviews also making headlines. He said he's open to lifting sanctions on Russia and wasn't committed to the long-standing one China policy. He also called NATO obsolete, as you just heard, criticized the EU, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, and said Brexit would end up being a great thing. So what do Trump's comments really mean, and does it signal any kind of shift in foreign policy? We asked PJ Crowley, author and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State.
He was an anti-establishment candidate, and at least as we are poised for his inauguration, he will come into office as an anti-establishment president. Now that will shift over time, but he is very sympathetic to the Brexit vote, and obviously should Britain leave, and every expectation is that they will depart. It will be necessary for the United States to pursue a new trade agreement with Britain.
Going back to NATO and what he said as far as NATO being obsolete, General Mattis, who is the man he has picked to be the defense minister, during his confirmation hearings, he called NATO the most successful military alliance probably in modern history, maybe ever. Clearly, there are issues as important as NATO that these two men don't see eye to eye. There is a disconnect.
I mean, we really don't yet know, what it is that Donald Trump truly believes.
We know what he said.
And what it is that is just simply posturing on the prospect of a better deal. U.S. presidents, U.S. defense secretaries since the end of the Cold War have all been encouraging European nations to spend more on their own defense and to take over a greater share of the burden represented by NATO. Trump has obviously taken that to a new level of extreme. His observation that allies need to carry their own weight is fair. His observation that NATO was obsolete is an error.
How concerned are you, PJ, that Trump will shake up based on what we've heard? We've got another week to go before he's president. Obviously, again, we're going by what he has said, by what he has tweeted. Is he playing with fire when it comes to one China policy? This is a cornerstone of U.S.-China relations in place for 40 years.
I think we're just going to have to see how much of this posturing translates into actual policy, or how much of this posturing actually is a lead-in to a negotiation, better deals. That's one of probably the key messages from the Trump campaign, was that he recognizes the importance of the U.S.-China relationship, but believes that the relationship has worked largely to the economic and strategic benefit of Beijing rather than Washington. How that proceeds once he actually is able to sit down with President Xi, whether they work out a new understanding. I think there are questions both in Beijing and in Washington about what will be possible.
Let me ask you a question about Russia. Last week, finally an admission of sorts, if you'd like to call it that Russia could have been behind cyber attacks during the U.S. election. Again, in a recent interview, he has suggested he's open to lifting economic sanctions against Moscow. What do you make of this cozy relationship between Trump and Putin while he's sparring with NATO, with Germany, as well as China?
There seems to be some sort of sympathy there. There seems to be a desire on both sides for a more constructive relationship. And yet Trump has seemed to acknowledge, and certainly his nominees have acknowledged, that the odds of another reset in relations between the United States and Russia are highly problematic. Trump has said, for example, he'd like to see the United States and Russia pursue another arms agreement. That actually is a very, very logical and potentially productive area of cooperation, but certainly his nominees, having a much more realistic view of the world, perhaps, are poised to come into office highly skeptical that over time the United States can achieve a constructive relationship with Russia.